I didn't expect to start making music at 37. That sentence still surprises me when I say it out loud. I had never studied it, never touched an instrument with any real intention, and had quietly filed the idea away somewhere, in a drawer I stopped opening a long time ago. Music belonged to other people. People who had started young, who had trained, who carried some native gift I assumed I simply didn't have. Then I started experimenting with AI tools that could turn ideas into sound. And something I didn't see coming happened. I stopped performing my lack of skill and started just making things. The gap between imagining something and actually being able to hear it collapsed. And in that collapse, I found something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: the specific, almost disorienting joy of making something that didn't exist before I made it. But what I keep turning over isn't really about the technology. The technology is just a thing that opened the door. What interests me more is the door itself, and the fact that I had bricked it over so completely that I didn't even remember it was there. Because here's what I think was actually happening: I had conflated two entirely separate things: the desire to create and the technical ability to execute on that desire. For most of human history, those were genuinely inseparable. You couldn't make music without years of practice. You couldn't paint without knowing how to hold a brush. The gap between the impulse and the output was measured in years, sometimes decades, and most people, quietly and practically, decided the distance wasn't worth crossing. So the desire didn't disappear, it just got reclassified, tucked into the category of things that aren't for me. What AI tools did, at least for me, was interrupt that logic. Not by making me skilled exactly, but by making the distance navigable. The gap between what I could imagine and what I could actually produce shrank just enough that I was willing to try. And once I was willing to try, something else happened that I didn't expect. I started to care. Not just about the output, but about the process, about what it felt like to have an impulse and follow it somewhere real. I think about how many people are carrying something similar, a creative identity they never developed, not because the impulse wasn't there, but because the on ramp was missing. The painter who never painted, the writer who composed entire paragraphs in their head on the commute home and never wrote a single one down. The composer who only ever made music in the shower. For centuries, the gatekeeping wasn't just institutional, it was also deeply technical. You needed skill, resources, access, time, and those barriers filtered out most of the people who might have made things. And we don't really know what was lost in that filtering. We only know what got through. What's strange about this particular moment is that it doesn't just change what people can make, it changes what people discover about themselves. Because you genuinely cannot know if you love something until you've actually done it. And for most of history, a lot of people never got that far. They formed an opinion about what they were and weren't based on the absence of an opportunity they never had. There might be a version of you that's been waiting, quietly, not for permission exactly, but for something to close the gap. At some point, and you probably can't locate the exact moment, you made a decision about what kind of person you are. Not a dramatic one, not something you sat down and reasoned through, more like a quiet administrative act, a small internal filing. This goes here, that doesn't apply to me. Most of those decisions are perfectly reasonable. You're not athletic. You're not someone who enjoys large crowds. Fine. Useful to know. The self needs a working model of itself or it can't function. But somewhere in that same pile of practical self-knowledge, things got archived that maybe deserved a second look. Creative things, expressive things, the version of you that might have made music, or painted, or written something, quietly filed away alongside the stuff that was genuinely accurately true. What's strange is how early it happens, and how rarely it traces back to a single moment of failure. More often it accumulates. A comment that landed wrong when you were young, a sibling who was clearly the artistic one, a comparison that stuck longer than it should have, a class you quietly avoided, and then years of not doing the thing, which slowly became its own evidence. You haven't done it, therefore you can't, therefore you aren't. The logic is circular, but it doesn't feel that way from the inside. From the inside, it feels like self-awareness. There's a particular kind of confidence that gets mistaken for realism. The person who says, "I'm just not creative," with a settled certainty, as though they did the research, ran the experiment, weighed the evidence, and arrived at a clean conclusion. But most of the time, the experiment was never actually run. What happened instead was something more like drift. The gap between wanting to try something and actually trying it just widened quietly over years. Not because of any firm decision, but because nothing ever made the crossing feel worth attempting. We do this with so many things. We construct the self-concept from partial evidence, from echoes of other people's opinions, from the shape of our early experiences, and then we treat it as though it were a fixed measurement rather than a first draft. A first draft written when we were young, by someone who didn't have nearly enough information yet. The filed away version of yourself isn't necessarily wrong. Sometimes you genuinely aren't built for a thing. But there's a meaningful difference between discovering that through actual experience and deciding it in advance to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. One is information. The other is insulation. What I've started to wonder, and this is something I couldn't have articulated before I actually tried making music, is how much of the self we think we know is really just the self we stopped questioning. Not because the questions were answered, because we got comfortable with the silence where the answers would have been. The filed away self doesn't disappear, it just stops asking to be opened, until something comes along that makes opening it feel possible. And then you find out, maybe with some surprise, that there's still something inside. Some of the most significant moments in a person's inner life aren't dramatic realizations. They're quiet corrections. The moment you discover that a story you've been telling yourself simply isn't as settled as you thought it was. There's a performance most of us have given so many times we've forgotten it's a performance. You've probably seen it, maybe done it. Someone asks if you can sing, and before a single note has left your body, you're already laughing. Oh God, no, I'm terrible. Someone mentions drawing, and a hand goes up in cheerful surrender. I can't even do a stick figure. The disclaimer arrives before the attempt. The self-deprecation is so practiced, so immediate that it stops feeling like a choice. But at some point, it was. There's a version of this that's just social lubrication, a way of managing expectations, keeping things light, making yourself easy to be around. And that's real. But underneath it, something else sometimes happens. The performance starts to harden into belief. Say I'm not creative enough times, and the brain, ever efficient, begins to take you at your word. It stops looking for evidence that might complicate the story. You become, functionally, the thing you've been performing. What's interesting about identity is how much of it gets maintained through repetition rather than experience. We don't constantly re-examine who we are from first principles. We recite. We repeat the shorthand version of ourselves in conversation after conversation, and that shorthand slowly becomes the only version we bother consulting. The fuller, messier, more uncertain draft, the one that includes all the things we haven't tried yet, gets less and less air. There are real social benefits to declaring yourself bad at something. It lowers the stakes immediately. It earns up particular kind of warmth because people tend to respond well to what looks like humility. And it closes the loop on a vulnerability before anyone else can get there first. If you announce your own incompetence, no one else gets to announce it for you. The preemptive self-roast is in its way a form of control, a way of deciding how the story ends before it even begins. But here's what it costs. Every time you perform the limitation, you make it slightly more real. Not because the performance is revealing a truth that was already there, but because performance has a way of calcifying into one. We are not nearly as separate from what we enact as we'd like to believe. The body learns the posture, the mind learns the story, and eventually neither one goes looking for a different version. What would happen if you simply didn't do it? Not with sudden false confidence, not with some dramatic reversal, just a small pause before the reflex fires. Just enough space to ask, is this actually true, or is this just what I've been saying? Because I haven't really tried and I can't are meaningfully different statements. And somewhere along the way, a lot of people quietly stopped noticing the difference. That small hesitation, just before the rehearsed disclaimer, might be one of the more interesting places a person can find themselves. It's the gap between who you've been performing and who you might actually be. And in that gap, there's still room for something you haven't found out yet. The role was never formally auditioned for, it was just gradually assumed. And what's been gradually assumed can sometimes be just as quietly set down. Everyone who has ever tried to make something knows the feeling. You have a clear image in your head, or a sound, or a sentence, and then you try to get it out into the world, and what arrives is diminished, flattened, a rough approximation of the thing you could already hear perfectly in some internal space that has no friction, no physics, no execution required. That distance between the imagined thing and the made thing is one of the most quietly deflating experiences in creative life. And for a lot of people, it's also the last experience they have with it. They feel the gap, decide it means something about them, and stop. But the gap isn't a verdict, it's just a distance. And distance, unlike talent, is something that changes. What makes the gap so disorienting is that imagination runs ahead of execution by design. The internal version of something doesn't have to fight gravity. It doesn't contend with the limits of your hands or your instruments or your vocabulary on a given Tuesday afternoon. It exists in a frictionless space where all your taste has already been absorbed, where you carry the accumulated sensibility of everything you've ever heard or read or seen, and where none of that has to be technically reproduced. Of course, it sounds better in there. It hasn't been born yet. And this is the part that doesn't get said enough. Taste develops faster than skill. You could spend years absorbing great music, extraordinary writing, films that rearrange something inside you, and your sense of quality gets quietly refined through all of it. But the ability to produce at that level doesn't come along for the ride. It has to be built separately, slowly, through repetition and failure and more repetition. So, for a long stretch, the gap between what you can perceive and what you can actually make isn't just real, it's enormous. Most people encounter this early and interpret it as a sign, a signal that they don't belong here, that people who are genuinely made for this don't feel it, that for the naturally gifted, the thing in their head and the thing on the page arrived already matched. But that's not what actually happens. The gap is nearly universal. What differs is what people decide it means. Some close it gradually through the slow accumulation of practice. Some find tools that narrow it, instruments, collaborators, software, things that meet them partway between the imagined version and the made one. And some people spend years holding the imagined thing carefully in mind, never quite finding their way across, but never entirely letting go of it either. That last group might be larger than anyone talks about. What I keep coming back to is that the gap itself isn't the problem. The gap is just feedback, impersonal, structural, almost boring in its universality. It exists for nearly everyone who has ever tried to make anything worth making. The thing that does the real damage isn't the distance, it's the story attached to it. The decision that the gap is evidence of a permanent ceiling rather than a temporary condition. That interpretation is what makes people stop. Not the distance itself, the meaning they decide the distance has. Every made thing that exists in the world started as an imagined thing that was willing to survive the crossing. Think about everything that was never made. Not the things that were made and lost, the burned libraries, the forgotten manuscripts, or the paintings that didn't survive centuries of neglect or war. Those losses are real, documented, mourned in their way. But they're at least legible as loss. What's harder to think about is the other category, the things that were never made at all. The music that lived and died inside someone who never had access to an instrument. The stories that stayed unwritten because writing required resources most people didn't have. The paintings that weren't painted because paint cost money and time cost survival. For most of human history, making things required infrastructure. Not just talent or desire, infrastructure. Physical materials, years of training, institutional access, social permission. The barriers weren't only about who was allowed in, they were also about who could afford the on-ramp in the first place. And those two filters, access and permission, operated together across centuries to shape not just who created, but what got created. What kinds of ideas made it into the permanent record? Whose inner life became part of the shared culture? We tend to think of cultural history as a fairly complete picture. It isn't. It's a highly filtered one. What survived is largely what was made by people who had the training, the resources, the institutional backing, or the social position to produce it. Which means the voices that were systematically excluded from those conditions, by class, by geography, by gender, by circumstance, are mostly absent from that record. Not because they had nothing to express, because the infrastructure to express it simply wasn't available to them. That's an enormous volume of human experience that never found form. And we have no way of knowing what it contained. We can reason about it. We can say with some confidence that the inner lives of people who were never handed an instrument were no less complex or interesting than those who were. That imagination and the impulse to make things didn't sort itself neatly along lines of access. But we can't hear what was lost. We only know what got through. What got through is extraordinary. The range of which human beings have made under constraint and across centuries is genuinely staggering. But the selection biases we're sitting with, because what we call the canon, what we call the tradition, is not the full spectrum of human creative possibility. It's a sample shaped by who had access to the means of making things, and by what those particular people were positioned to see and feel and say. This is part of what makes the current moment feel significant in a way that goes beyond convenience or novelty. The loosening of the link between creative desire and technical infrastructure doesn't just change what individuals can do in a given afternoon. It changes what the culture might eventually look like, what voices get in, what experiences find form, what gets added to the record that simply wasn't there before. We're at an early stage of that shift. It isn't fully legible yet, but there's something worth paying attention to in the idea that the filter is loosening, that the sample is slowly getting wider. What comes through when barriers lower isn't just more of the same, because the people who were kept out weren't trying to make the same things that got through. They were carrying something else entirely. Nobody warns you about this part. You finish something, or something close enough to finished, and you sit with it for a moment, and the feeling arrives that you weren't expecting. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction in any clean sense, something quieter and harder to name. Something closer to, this didn't exist before, and now it does, and I made it. That feeling is strange the first time it shows up, because it doesn't match any version of creativity you'd been handed. The tortured artist, the effortless genius, the dramatic flash of inspiration followed by the perfectly executed result. It's more ordinary than any of that, and somehow more significant. There's a particular quality to caring about something you made yourself. It's different from caring about something you admire. A piece of music you love, a book that rearranged how you think. Admiration keeps a certain distance. But when you make something, even something modest, even something genuinely flawed, the relationship is different. You were there when it didn't exist. You were the reason it crossed over. And that creates an attachment that's difficult to explain to someone who hasn't felt it yet. What surprised me when I started making music was that the caring arrived before the quality. I made something rough and imperfect and assembled largely from intuition and accident, and I still cared about it in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because I thought it was good, I wasn't sure it was, but because it was mine in a way that nothing I had ever listened to or watched or read could be.
You can love something completely, return to it 100 times, let it live inside you, and it will never belong to you the way a thing you made does. That's not a minor distinction. It changes the relationship between you and the work, between you and the act of making itself. There's also what it opens, because caring about something you made tends to create a pull toward making another thing. Not because the first thing was good enough to justify a second, but because the feeling itself was worth returning to. Making something generates an appetite for making more things. And that appetite is its own kind of information. It tells you something about yourself that simply wasn't available before you did it. A lot of people who think of themselves as non-creative have never had this feeling. Not because they're incapable of it, because they never followed an impulse far enough to get there. The caring lives on the other side of completion. And completion means getting through all the parts where you're not sure it's working, where the gap between imagined and made is embarrassingly visible, where the internal version is still so much better than the thing in front of you. Most people turn back somewhere in that stretch, but the feeling waits on the other side, unclaimed. What nobody tells you is that creativity isn't something you discover you have ahead of time. It's something you discover by doing it. The capacity was there. The feeling was always available. It was just waiting for someone to stay in the room long enough to let it arrive. Making something teaches you that you are someone who makes things. That sounds circular? It isn't.
At some point, someone told you that certain things required permission. Maybe not in those words, maybe it was subtler, communicated through the architecture of institutions, through the way legitimacy got distributed, through who was taken seriously and who quietly wasn't. But the message was consistent. Some things you could just do, and some things required credentials first. The right training, the right validation, the right number of years spent in the right rooms before you are allowed to call yourself someone who did the thing. It's worth asking where that idea actually came from. Not to dismiss it entirely, some of it is reasonable. Certain things really do require training before you touch them. But somewhere along the way, the logic expanded far beyond its reasonable territory. It crept into domains where the only thing at risk was quality or taste or originality, and it settled in as though it had always belonged there. The art school, the conservatory, the apprenticeship that lasted long enough to be its own kind of loyalty test. These were never only educational structures. They were also gatekeeping structures. They determined who got to be taken seriously, who got reviewed, represented, curated, recorded, published. And the gatekeeping wasn't just institutional. It became psychological. People absorbed it. They began to believe that the credential wasn't just useful but necessary, that without it, whatever they made was somehow provisional, not quite real. There's a word that's done a lot of work here: amateur. It's come to mean something like less than, someone who doesn't quite rise to the level of the thing they're attempting. But the word itself, from the Latin through the French, just means someone who loves something, someone who does it for love rather than pay. At some point, that quietly flipped. The love became the problem. If you hadn't suffered for it, hadn't been formally certified in it, hadn't paid some long and verifiable dues for it, the love wasn't enough. The love was actually a little bit embarrassing. What's shifting now is harder to name than it first appears. The institutions haven't disappeared. The credentials haven't lost all their value. It's more that the monopoly is loosening. The ability to make things that are real, things that can find an audience, things that move people, things that matter to someone, no longer lives exclusively behind the gates. It's spreading into spaces those structures never quite reached. And with that comes a question that probably deserves more attention than it's getting. What was the permission for exactly? In some cases, it was about quality, ensuring craft, shared standards, a minimum level of seriousness. In other cases, if we're being honest with ourselves, it was about control, about who got to participate in the conversation and who got to define its terms. Those are two very different things, and they've been bundled together for long enough that it's become genuinely difficult to tell them apart. What's interesting about permission is that it was always, in some fundamental sense, optional.
Not comfortable to ignore, not without social cost, but optional. Some people made the thing without it, and the world eventually caught up to them. The ones we tend to remember as pioneers were often just the ones who didn't wait. The gate was real. It just was never the only way in.
It happens in the in-between places. In the shower, on the commute, in the 20 minutes before sleep finally arrives. Something stirs, a melody, an opening line, an image that appears fully formed and vivid and entirely yours. You think, I should do something with this. And then the water turns off, or the train reaches your stop, or sleep actually comes, and the thing dissolves back into wherever it came from. Most people carry an inner creative life they've never shown anyone. Not a small one, a substantial one, full of music that was never recorded, stories that were drafted and redrafted in the mind but never written down, images that arrived with real specificity and then evaporated for lack of a surface to land on. This life runs in parallel, quietly, persistently, alongside everything else. It just never crosses over. There's something particular about those in-between states. The shower, the long drive, that half-awake hour before morning fully arrives. The conscious mind loosens its grip a little. The part of you that's constantly managing and assessing and presenting itself takes a breath. And in that pause, something else moves. Something that seems to have been waiting for exactly this degree of inattention to slip through. The ideas that come in those moments often feel more like discovery than invention, like you found something rather than made it. And then, almost every time, they go. Not because they weren't real, because there was nothing to catch them. No instrument within reach, no open document, no way to translate the thing in the internal language it arrived in into anything that could exist outside of you. The commute ended, the day resumed, and the idea dissolved the way dreams do, quickly and without leaving much behind. I think about how much creative life exists in this suspended state. How many people are carrying compositions they have never heard outside their own head. Chapters written so many times in the mind that they feel nearly finished, except they've never existed anywhere but there. Entire bodies of work that live in the margins of the day, that breathe for a few minutes and then go quiet. A whole parallel world of things that almost were. What's worth noticing is that this inner life isn't passive, it's generative. The shower composer isn't simply daydreaming, they're actually composing. The process is real even when the output isn't. The imagination is building something, creating structure, responding to itself, revising, returning. It's just doing it in a place where nothing can be kept. What the current moment offers, among other things, is a shorter distance between that inner place and an external one. Tools that can catch something before it dissolves. Not perfectly, not without losing something in translation, but enough. Enough that the thing forming in your head has a better chance of surviving contact with the world than it ever did before. The shower composer was always a composer. The question was only ever whether anything would be there to receive what they were making. Some of the most interesting creative work happening right now is coming from people who have been composing quietly in the dark for years and are only just finding the light switch. We've been circling something this whole time. Not a single idea exactly, more like a shape. The shape of a distance. The space between who we are and who we might have been if certain things had been different. If the on-ramp had been there when we needed it. If the gate had been open. If the right tool had arrived at the right moment and the thing we were quietly carrying had found somewhere to go. That's a complicated thing to sit with because it isn't quite loss. You can't mourn something you never had. But it isn't nothing either. There's a real weight to the versions of ourselves that never developed. The creative self that got filed away before it was ever genuinely tested. The impulse that was there, alive and specific, that just never found the surface to land on. That weight is worth acknowledging, even when there's no clean way to resolve it. What I keep coming back to is the word buried. Not lost, not gone,
Buried implies something still there, underneath, intact, if compressed, which is a meaningfully different statement about possibility than gone is. A buried thing can, under the right conditions, be unburied. It doesn't require rebuilding from nothing, it just requires something to disturb the surface. The thread running through everything we've explored here, the identity filed away before it was tested, the incompetence rehearsed until it felt like fact, the gap between the imagined thing and the made thing, the filter that shaped what got through and what didn't, the feeling that only arrives on the other side of completion, the gate and who it kept out, the compositions that live only in the in between places. None of it is as settled as it looks. The categories we place ourselves in are not permanent. The roles we assumed are not fixed by anything more durable than habit and repetition. The creative life running quietly in parallel is not necessarily fated to stay there. The distance between who you've been presenting and who makes things turns out not to be a fixed measurement. It changes, sometimes faster and more completely than you'd expect. What this particular moment seems to be offering, imperfectly, with real questions still attached, is a lowering of the first terrain, the on ramp that was missing. Not a guarantee of anything on the other side, not a shortcut past the real work that making things requires, but a narrowing of the gap that was always the first obstacle. The one that stopped people before they ever discovered whether they cared, before they ever got to find out what they were carrying and what it might become. And caring, it turns out, is not something you can assess from a distance. You can't know what making something will mean to you until you've actually made something, which is the part nobody warns you about, and which might also be the most important part of all of this. So here's what I find myself genuinely wondering, not as a conclusion, but as an opening. Is there a version of you that's been composing in the dark? Something real you've been carrying in the in-between moments that never found its way out? Not because it wasn't there, not because you didn't have it, but simply because nothing was ever quite there to receive it. What would it look like if something finally was?